Hi, this is TheHande Mäkinen, and unfortunately, this is going to be a two-part video. Now, this is my fourth attempt of trying to film this particular video, and the reason I rejected all the previous takes is because the length of the video just keeps getting ridiculous, and because I don't want to turn this into a shitty hour-long video essay, or an even shittier half-hour video essay, I finally came to the conclusion that the only way I was going to make this video in a way that's going to be watchable was to just cut it in two halves. So anyway, I like cartoons, and in the mid-90s my family got Cartoon Network, and I was immediately offered a huge smorgasbord of different cartoons from different eras of history, because that's what Cartoon Network used to do. And what I always found interesting was just how different cartoons from different periods of history looked like, and this is what I wanted to make a video about. Now, today, in part one, I'm basically just going to go through the history of American animation, and then in the second video, I will talk about my favorite cartoons in each of the eras of 20th century cartoons. Now, there's a lot of caveats to this video, which I'm going to say out here. First of all, I am only focusing on US cartoons for obvious reasons, because the US has been producing cartoons ever since animation became a thing, at truly gobsmacking amounts and consistency. Seriously, no other country even comes close to the amount of cartoons that the US has produced. The only one that even comes remotely close is maybe Japan. And I'm only focusing on the 20th century, because starting from the early 2000s, the entire field of animation just got so versatile and broad that it's impossible to just find one stylistic choice that would define an entire decade. Lastly, and most importantly, I'm really only focusing on two different types of animation. For the first part of the 20th century, I'm only talking about animated short films made for theatrical distribution, and in the second half, animation produced for television. I will not be talking about animated feature films here, because otherwise this video would very quickly devolve into a history of Disney, which I'm going to still mention several times in the history section regardless. So now that you know the premise of the video, let's get on with talking about the history of American animation. So the accepted nomenclature for the history of American animation divides it into 5 eras, but I'm going to take a little bit of liberty here in dividing the 20th century into 6 separate eras, because this is how I will be talking about these cartoons when I get to part 2, where I'm going to be discussing my favorites. Basically, for the purposes of this two-part video, I'm going to be dividing everything up to 1937 as the black and white era of cartoons, and there's a few reasons for this. If you've ever watched cartoons from this era, you will notice how often the characters have these weird, sort of unnatural circular motions. And the reason for this is that projection technology was just so bad that in fact these cartoons literally often just used two colors, black and white, and many times they didn't even have any shades of gray. Fun fact, this is why all the classic Disney characters usually wear white gloves, because it helped distinguish the motion of their hands from the rest of their body. Now, 1937 is an important threshold moment for animation, because that is the year that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs debuted, and this helped popularize color cartoons. Now, there had actually been color cartoons before this. Disney came out with the very first one in 1932, but they very sneakily then made an exclusivity deal with Technicolor, which technically prevented all other studios from making color cartoons around this time. This was a very alpha male move from Disney, who were really the only dedicated animation studio around that time, because all the other cartoons around that time were just being made by the big movie studios as well. Now, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was important because it immediately made the whole subset of color cartoons that much more popular, and now that the floodgates were open, we enter into the era of the late 30s and early 40s, which I like to call the Bucolic period. It was during this time that popular characters like Donald Duck and Daffy Duck, as well as Tom and Jerry, came into existence. But you will notice that in these very early appearances, while the animation quality was super crisp, with lush, detailed backgrounds, the characters often look, kinda weird. So basically what had happened, now that animation could really use color for the first time, Animators went a little crazy and added maybe too much detail, and as a result, a lot of these cartoons began suffering from what is known as the uncanny valley effect. This is when something looks a little too realistic, and the effect it has on the audience is repulsion, but at the same time, we had that beautiful level of detail, which is why I call this the bucolic period. It really took until the mid-40s before a lot of the iconic characters like Bugs and Daffy and Tom and Jerry actually started looking like the way we did. And again, we can credit this to Disney. Basically, what happened was a Disneyfication of these character designs. After Snow White, Disney of course kept making more animated movies, Pinocchio, Dumbo, Fantasia, and Bambi, with a common denominator being that they often starred cute animal characters. There's a very telling story about the making of Pinocchio. Disney animators really struggled with the concept of having a wooden doll as a main character and had a really hard time just making Pinocchio look likable and relatable. So at some point they just basically gave up and just had Pinocchio be a normal looking child with a weird wooden nose, which just emphasized that there was something weird about him. And I believe it is because of this principle why the design of all these other animal characters also gradually began to evolve into more recognizable shapes. And this ushered in the first era of cartoons that I'm personally a big fan of, which roughly goes from 1945 to roughly 1955. I call this the Zany Era. Two animators that we can really thank for this era of cartoons are Chuck Jones and Tex Avery. Now granted, they actually did start making these kinds of zany animal cartoons already in the late 30s, but like I said, it took until the mid-40s before the characters began to have these cute rounded shapes that we now recognize them, and Warner Brothers in particular started having their iconic assembly of animal characters. But also, the droopy cartoons by Tex Avery were very influential in this era because they introduced this breakneck pace of non-stop gags, which really exemplifies this particular era of cartoons. Oftentimes, this era gets criticized for the high levels of violence, but it's important to note, of course, that these cartoons were not being shown to just children. They were usually shown in movie theaters as the minor feature to a main feature film, which is where we get that term, and these cartoons were being viewed by adults as much as they were by kids. So this is why they would often slip in very risque and sometimes quite adult jokes as well, and which is why there was a lot of rampant drinking and smoking in these old cartoons as well. Now, the Zany era of cartoons ends roughly in the mid-50s, and a big reason for this was the downturn in theater attendance due to the rising popularity of television. Now, TV had been a thing in the United States since the 1930s, but in those halcyon days, it was still not the main source of entertainment for all Americans. So in fact, movie theaters actually used to offer a lot of the same services as television used to do. When you paid for a movie ticket, you weren't just going to see a single movie, you would also see a bunch of advertisements, that tiny, funny cartoon, or sometimes a newsreel, and if you were really lucky, you might even go see a second movie altogether, a B feature, if you will. And you might be wondering, did anybody really have the time to watch two movies in a row? You have to remember that movies back then were barely over 60 minutes, so combined, the main and the B feature were like half the running time of a modern movie. But you can understand that all of this obviously cost money. People have to really ask themselves, did they really want to spend money to go see a newsreel and a cartoon, advertisements, and maybe a movie that you weren't sure if you even liked when you could just, stay at home and do that exact same thing for free? Now, cartoons were being shown on television already before this, but they were literally just re-showings or reruns of the theatrical shorts that had come before, although they didn't use the term rerun back then. And partially because of this reason, although not entirely, MGM shut down their entire animation division, which caused two of their employees, two guys called Hanna and Barbera, to go into business for themselves and focus on making cartoons for television. This started the Collared Animals era of cartoons, which lasted from the mid-50s roughly to the mid-60s, and saw the rise of characters like Huckleberry Hound, Snugglepuss, and of course Yogi Bear. But equally important is the influence of the Flintstones. Now, the reason all these animal characters had collars for seemingly no good reason was because that hit the animation scene, because because Hanna-Barbera had to seriously cut down on the cost of animation around this time. If you look at the cartoons of the late 50s and early 60s and compare them to the cartoons from the prior decades, you'll notice how much more smoother and nicer the animation is in those old cartoons and how much more primitive and stocky the animation looks by comparison. The reason is that Hanna-Barbera started using something called limited animation, while the earlier cartoons used full animation. Full animation meaning that the individual cells to make up the motion in those cartoons were all unique and almost never reused, whereas in TV animation, they would only animate certain parts of the characters at a time, and the colors on those animal characters helped to hide the seam between the body and the head. This needed to happen because in those early days, television networks just didn't have the same kind of money as the big film studios had to throw at animation, so obviously costs needed to be cut. But Flintstones also forced cartoons to evolve in a different form. Now the colored animal shows obviously still had cartoony antics going on, but the Flintstones, for instance, was the length of an entire episode of a sitcom because it was a parody of the show Honeymooners, which meant that those cartoony antics became fewer and further apart, and there needed to be a larger emphasis on dialogue-based comedy, facial expressions, and occasionally sight gags. But I think it was actually kind of an important development because it forced cartoons to mature into having more deeper characters with more developed personalities. Now, eventually television cartoons did become profitable enough that by the late 60s, the production qualities of Hanna-Barbera cartoons started to get much better, and the character designs got a lot less lumpier. Also, what started happening in the mid-60s was the rise of action cartoons, stuff like Johnny Quest and a lot of the early superhero cartoons, mostly Batman, because Batman was quite popular at the time. And earlier in the decade, another animation studio, Filmation, was formed. And in fact, for a little while, Hanna-Barbera and Filmation kind of traded turns in making superhero cartoons. It's funny that this was around the time when these really started to take off, but also teenagers started appearing as the main characters of cartoons. Filmation managed to secure the rights to the Archie comics and made the highly popular Archie show, which I've never seen, but I'm kind of curious for because the voice actor for He-Man had his start in that. And Hanna-Barbera then wanted to create their own show with a cast of mostly teenagers, reflecting the fact that teenage culture really came to its own during the 60s, and what they created obviously was Scooby-Doo. Unfortunately, there were no huge developments basically for the entirety of the 70s, which is why I tend to lump the late 60s and pretty much the entirety of the 70s into a single era, the Scooby-Doo era. Because basically cartoons around this time tended to be mostly either Scooby-Doo clones, and I don't just mean Hanna-Barbera's competitors were making them. Hanna-Barbera themselves were making constant revisions of Scooby-Doo as well, in the form of stuff like Fangface, Jabberjaw, Josie and the Pussycats. And even though superhero cartoons had to really walk on eggshells around this time because parent advocacy groups were starting to get really concerned with the amount of violence in cartoons around this time, which really stifled creativity. And also forced cartoon studios to just ride on various trends in order to make it through this period. So basically, in-house American animation had kind of come to the natural endpoint of what it could achieve by the late 70s. So during the 1980s, two major developments happened that completely changed the complexion of cartoons. Now, cartoons from the 80s looked a lot shinier and brighter and more colorful, but this was because American animation studios basically began outsourcing the work overseas. Studios like Dick, Disney, Hanna-Barbera, and even this new kid on the block called Ruby Spears would typically have foreign animation studios do the really complex action stuff, which really left the American animators with all the boring stuff to do, like speech cycles and things. And the reason was obvious. During the last 2 decades, as television animation had become so commonplace, various countries had started creating their own animation studios and could oftentimes do much higher quality work for a fraction of the cost. And because animation was so expensive still, it was very tempting for these studios to just use cheap foreign labor to make their cartoons. Unfortunately, this also meant that there was less work for American animators, and this led to a lot of layoffs and things, One of the few holdouts during this era was actually Filmation, which continued to do all of their animation in-house. But Filmation were also quite fortunate in this because they bagged the rights to this toy line called Masters of the Universe. And in fact, this started the second major trend of the 1980s, which was cartoons made to sell action figures. Now, sometimes this could be very fruitful, such as in the case of something like Transformers or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and yes, TMNT was a comic book first, but the late 80s cartoon adaptation was made explicitly to market a line of action figures based off them. But this also caused a bit of an unhealthy relationship, which meant that, while giving us a lot of great action cartoons with great action animation, did unfortunately mean that these shows often lasted only for a single season when the toys inevitably didn't sell very well. And the level of commercialization in cartoons around this time got to almost disgusting levels even. But you know, somebody must have made a huge payday off of it, because this toy-cartoon combo did last all the way into the 1990s as well, and only really started to taper off right around the early 2000s. Now, the 80s was also kind of an end era of traditional animation. When you look at the iconic characters from this time period, they all still have very soft lines, are very cute with big eyes, and obviously things were very colorful and shiny back then. And there was a rather stark turn in the 1990s with an aesthetic push in the complete opposite direction. Now, you may be thinking that I'm going to be calling the 1990s the extreme era of cartoons, but rather I would call this the gross-out era of cartoons. Because the cartoon aesthetic of the 90s that immediately jumps to mind was put forth thanks to a show called Ren and Stimpy. Now, I am not a big fan of Ren and Stimpy, but I cannot deny its cultural impact in 90s cartoons. In a way, Ren and Stimpy was kind of returned to the zany era of the 40s and 50s, with cartoon violence again being a major emphasis, but this time it was also peppered with actual bodily harm and also just bodily humor in general. Hence the gross-out part. The gross-out cartoon that I remember more vividly is actually Hanna-Barbera's Two Stupid Dogs, which tended to focus more on the zany and silly side of things. But I can see that this emphasis on slightly gross and over-exaggerated character designs was very successful during this time, since Nickelodeon really milked it for all it's worth. But I'll give Nickelodeon a little bit of credit as well, because they also really began focusing on a trend that had already started in the late 80s, which was cartoons focused on kid characters. Before this, kids in cartoons were typically just the sidekicks or minor characters in cartoons, and throughout the 90s, they started to take the center stage even more. There was also a higher rise in adult-oriented cartoons, started off in the late 80s by The Simpsons, who kind of hit the height of their popularity during the early to mid-90s. And don't get me wrong, superhero cartoons didn't go away. If anything, they got even more popular. Particularly, Batman and Spider-Man, the animated series, are highly well remembered for their excellent story writing. But you will also notice that around this time, superhero cartoons got a lot more stylized as well. There you go. I was really trying to condense a lot of information into this video, and in part 2, we will look at those same eras again, but this time I'm going to look at them from the focus point of the cartoons that I personally like the best. So see you in part 2.